Hi, everybody. Well, thank you so much for joining us for today's installation of our Sierra Forum on defunding climate destruction. My name is Lena Moffitt, and I am a senior campaign director at Sierra Club of Sierra Club's Our Wild America campaign, coming to you from Washington, D.C. today. Our Sierra Forums are a great way for members like yourself to hear directly from our staff and our partners about the work that we're doing to fight for clean air, clean water, a stable climate, and protecting our public lands. We're so excited to be here talking with you about this really compelling topic. And thank you all so much for joining us, especially in these extraordinary times. On today's panel, we have a great host of panelists. We're going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up to the audience for Q&A. But before we get started, we have a very special guest, Sierra Club's Executive Director, Mike Brune, who's going to be talking with us about how the Sierra Club is weathering this crisis and continuing our work through the pandemic. Hand it over to you, Mike.
All right, thanks, Lena, and hi, everybody. It's good to see you all. I'm really excited about this presentation today. Before I came to the Sierra Club, many years ago now, I worked for an organization called Rainforest Action Network that did a fair amount of organizing and campaigning in the banking sector to push some of the largest banks in the country to help protect intact rainforests and the rights of their inhabitants. And so I've been excited to see the Sierra Club take on this work over the last few years, and really impressed with how we've been able to work in the private sector, work in coalition with other organizations, and move the needle pretty fast to have some of the largest banks in the country and around the world be part of the solution rather than being part of the problem when it comes to not just protecting the Arctic, but really turning the fight around on climate change. So I'm excited to have everybody on the call get exposed to this work, because I think it's some of the more exciting work that's happening, not just in the Sierra Club, but in the movement. I'm going to talk for just a couple minutes before we get into the panel about some work that we're doing on related to the COVID-19 virus, and just get a sense of how things are being handled internally. Today is May 13th, so we're now starting our third month closed down due to the virus. We closed down our offices starting on March 12th. So no offices are open, we're not traveling, we're not doing any public events, no outings. We're taking the health and safety of our staff and our volunteers and our members very seriously. We're also taking our social responsibility very seriously to do everything that we can to keep our people safe and to mitigate the risks that our community is facing as a result of the virus. Our hearts go out to, and our actions go out to help those who are suffering the most from this virus, and we're doing everything that we can to take our social responsibility seriously. So basically, if you want a sense of what the Sierra Club is doing, you can pretty much look to, say, Brian Kemp out of Georgia or Donald Trump, and we're doing pretty much the opposite of all of that. In spite of all of that, even though we have all of our staff working from home and our volunteers doing work from their homes as well, we've been able to achieve a lot in just the last couple months. Our litigation with other organizations against the Keystone XL pipeline has been successful. That project is delayed once again. It will not be built. We have had success in delaying the construction of a massive oil terminal that's being proposed down in the Gulf. We're preparing litigation against a couple additional pipelines down in the Gulf and a couple additional oil terminals down in the Gulf. We now have secured the retirement of 307 of the country's coal-fired power plants, and there are actually 2 more on the way in the Dakotas, 2 plants that will be replaced with wind that will save consumers money, create more jobs, and cut air and water pollution. So there is an enormous amount of work that is in our traditional lanes that we've been really effective at, particularly over the last couple months. And there's an additional amount of work on top of all of that that we've taken on over the last couple months. And I'll just highlight a couple quick things. One is we are strongly supporting the Rewind Act, which was introduced by Senator Merkley and Representative Barragan. The Rewind Act would basically oppose or prohibit the Trump administration from being allowed to bail out the fossil fuel industry, taking money that should be devoted to workers and families people in the healthcare industry, grocery clerks, and others who are helping to feed us and helping to keep us all healthy, money that has been diverted to aid fossil fuel executives and companies that took on a reckless amount of debt. So we're strongly supporting that bill, working to make sure that our taxpayer money isn't going to industries or executives that need to change, and instead is being invested in the communities that need it the most. Second thing that I would highlight is we have been very active over the last couple months in helping to shape and advocate for the people's bailout. There are now about 1,000 organizations and more than 100 members of Congress who have signed on to the 5 principles of the People's Bailout. You can Google People's Bailout or go to peoplesbailout.org and see all the organizations that are behind this and the values and principles of this work, which is basically to put health first, to make sure that we have adequate testing, adequate tracing, adequate resources being made available to those on the front lines of this crisis, but also the economic stimulus measures that are necessary in order to rebuild the world that we need rather than rebuilding the world that was deeply flawed to begin with, and making sure that we're expanding access to food. 1 in 5 children don't have access to food on a daily basis here in this country. So taking the steps that we need to have a society that we can be proud of, not a society that's riddled with the inequities that we're seeing today. So our work in the People's Bailout is an important part of what the Sierra Club is doing. We are advocating certainly for the climate components of the bailout, but also standing in support of those organizations who really need our support in helping the communities at the front lines of this crisis. And then the final thing I'll highlight is something actually that we talked about at more length on the last forum that we had last month, which is our work to stop utilities from being allowed to shut off access to electricity, excuse me, electricity and water. We shouldn't have to do this advocacy, to be honest with you. We shouldn't be shutting off water when we need everybody to be washing their hands. We shouldn't be shutting off power when people are having trouble because of events way outside of their control, making their payments to the utilities. We ought to be banding together as a society to help those who are less fortunate, not just because that's the right thing to do, but it's what keeps us all safe. And so the Sierra Club has been working. We've developed deep expertise in the electric sector over the last 20 years through our work to oppose coal plants and oppose gas plants and stimulate clean energy. So we're using those contacts, we're using that expertise, we're using the community relationships that we've developed to advocate for strong policies at the utility level, at the state level, and at the federal level for a complete moratorium on utility shutoffs in the future. So I wanted to give a quick highlight into all of this work as it's going on, and at least a little bit of a glimpse into how we're organizing and how we're doing our work in this pandemic. But I don't want to take too much time because we've got a lot to cover today. So let me just end by saying thank you to everybody on this call for all your support. Sierra Club is powered by the contributions from our members. We are highly leveraged in that we have thousands of volunteers who are working every day to achieve the Sierra Club's mission, but it's the generosity of our supporters that we need now more than ever. So thank you for all of your support. For many of you, it's over many decades. For some of you, it's just over the last few weeks. We appreciate you. We need your support and we need your generosity. So thanks for all that you're doing. And with that, I'll pass it back over to you, Lena.
Thank you so much, Mike, for that. Really appreciate it. And again, I want to thank all of you audience members tuning in today for our forum on how to defund climate destruction. Particularly in these extraordinary times, it's really exciting to see how enthusiastic Sierra Club members and our partners are to keep up this strong work to fight for the planet that we know is possible, a more sustainable and a more just future for us all. We had over 2,200 folks RSVP for this forum today, which is an unprecedented number, I am told. So a lot of interest in this really exciting topic. So let's get right to it. Thank you so much, Mike. So we are here to talk with you today about this really exciting strategy that is an increasingly important component of the way that the Sierra Club is working to fight the climate crisis. it's increasingly understood that the global financial sector, the banks, the insurance companies, the asset managers, are playing a really critical role in fueling the climate crisis by continuing to finance fossil fuels, deforestation, and the human rights abuses that so often go with both of those. And so we are doubling down on this strategy, particularly as actors like Trump may be less willing to listen to us. We're seeing that big corporations are starting to listen. So we are taking grassroots power directly to the global financial sector. And it's a really promising strategy that's just getting started. We've already seen some incredible responses from big banks like Wells Fargo and JP Morgan Chase saying that they are going to stop funding some of the most egregious projects out there. But we have a lot of work to do, and we are excited to double down and do that with you all. So I'm thrilled to introduce our illustrious panelists today. We have with us Dan Chu, the Executive Director of the Sierra Club Foundation. He's going to talk with us about the Foundation's innovative strategies to leverage their assets for good. We also have Ben Cushing, a campaign representative with the Sierra Club who leads our work in pushing the global financial sector to stop funding fossil fuels. And Rachel Heaton, the co-founder of Mazaska Talks, an Indigenous-led organization that's helping individuals and cities divest from the banks that are funding the destruction of Mother Earth. So let's go ahead and get started with some questions. So Dan, why don't I hand it to you, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about the Sierra Club Foundation and the work that you're doing at the foundation to shift trillions of dollars away from fossil fuels into more sustainable solutions.
Thanks, Lena, and thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm Dan Chu. I'm the Executive Director for the Sierra Club Foundation, and our role is to raise money and steward that from donors, funders, people that leave money to the Sierra Club in their will. And so every day, we're just so gratified that all of you are supporting us and the work that Mike and Ben and Lena and Rachel will be talking about here as well. It's just been really heartwarming in these difficult times that we continue to get contributions and have the trust of all of you as we move forward in making the world a better place. A couple of things I would say is that we do two primary things with those finances. One, about 8 years ago, we really set on a journey to divest from fossil fuels across all of our investments. And we also changed our banks. So we're now with a fossil-free bank called Amalgamated Bank as well, just to make sure that every dollar that's contributed to us is aligned with our mission and isn't actually making climate worse, but hopefully helping to stop the destruction from fossil fuels. And then more recently, we've been looking at investing in climate solutions, particularly those that also advance social justice outcomes. So we're really excited about directly investing, but also partnering with many other investors and funders to come in and bring the sorely needed capital into a lot of these communities to advance clean energy projects, to help with affordable housing, and other measures that really increase social justice across the nation. Within that large portfolio of positive investments, we do hold a small portion of shares in companies that are responsible for destroying the planet. And the reason we do that is so that we can continue to engage as an active shareholder at the annual meetings of these companies, and also to provide opportunities to open the door for many grassroots folks to show up either virtually nowadays or in person at these annual meetings and speak directly to the boards and CEOs of banks, oil companies, and other companies that we really want to change. So essentially we have those two strategies about directly investing and getting other investors on board in positive solutions, as well as providing opportunities to be an active shareholder. And you'll hear more about that from Ben and Rachel as we move forward. So thanks for having me today, and I'll pass it on back to Lena.
Thanks so much, Dan. Appreciate it. Really exciting to see the foundation leveraging its role as an activist institution too. Thank you for that. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us. I have to say, one of the greatest pleasures that I get at the Sierra Club is getting to work with partners like Mazaska Talks and getting to hear from leaders like yourself. So thank you so much for joining us and for the work that you're doing. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Mazaska Talks and the work that you do to fight projects like Dakota Access and get folks to move their money away from the banks that are backing those destructive projects?
Thank you guys for having me today. It's an honor to be on here with each one of you guys and all the expertise that you guys bring. First of all, my name is Rachel Heaton. I'm a member of the Muckleshoot tribe. I'm also a descendant of the Duwamish people. It's typically a tradition for us to introduce who we are. Typically, we introduce ourselves through who we are, our family, and the whole lineal thing, but we won't do that today. But, you know, something that we always try to do, I think in any of these conversations, when we're bringing together large organizations is really tapping in on our Indigenous communities and how that relates to the climate crisis and different things. And so it just helps to share, you know, why we do. We acknowledge, you know, the land that we're on. I personally, I'm on my own territory. We're on Duwamish lands, Muckleshoot lands. We're under 2 treaties here, and so it's always an educational thing to, you know, introduce people to the communities that they're working with. So Mazaska Talks started up about 4 years ago when it was after the city of Seattle had divested from Wells Fargo, and that initially stemmed from finding out the funding that these big banks were involved in for these fossil fuel projects that have gone through hundreds and hundreds of Indigenous lands and violations all over the world, not just here in the United States. And so we were able to tie that Seattle was invested or was with Wells Fargo and also Dakota Access Pipeline's largest funder out of the 65 funders was Wells Fargo. And so we really utilized that strategy to tie everyday actions that we do, depositing our checks in the bank, where we keep our money, where we pay our mortgage, those sort of things, and really talking to people and empowering them with the ability to have their own power within their own hands. So what Mazaska Talks means is money talks. And so divestment is not a new tool. So what we wanted to do was to talk to individuals about removing your money from those Wall Street banks and putting your money into community banks, into state banks, banks that were controlled by the communities, not Wall Street. So, so it started off as an individual thing and then moved to the cities. And so there was such an Indigenous involvement within, I mean, there was hundreds and hundreds of natives that came together when it came to the divestment and really pushing the city away from the bank. And so we wanted to make sure that because of the tie to Dakota Access Pipeline, the violation of sacred lands, the city and the land that it stood on, we wanted to be able to start bringing Indigenous issues to a forefront. And so by creating Mazaska Talks after the divestment, it gave us the ability to use the tools that we had here in Seattle to get other cities to divest, which then went from individuals to cities to universities, to one of Jackie Felder, who in San Francisco is currently running for state senate, also is one of our team members with Mazaska Talks, and we led the Divest the Globe, and eventually took this same tool, but then created the legislation to get a public bank created. So these are just some of the things that have come from the divestment from, you know, the Wells Fargo movement in Seattle. And so we could go on and on and on about all of this for so long, but what we're really trying to do is to utilize these tools, but to always put Indigenous people on the forefront, because we are the ones that are first affected by this climate crisis in terms of our fishing, our foods, our ecosystems. Everything depends on everything that's happening. And so we have 4% of the world's population protecting 80% of the biodiversity. And I hear Tara Hauschka say that very often. And so I think it's really important that we hone back in on understanding how important this work is. And so this is just a bit of what Mazaska Talks has done, but now we've moved instead of just being a tool, but to now also being a solution. And so now we're moving towards, like, the city of Seattle to, or the state of Washington to move towards public banking, and then moving that power into our communities, and again, away from these Wall Street banks, and then allowing us to make the decisions of what we want these investments that we're asking people to divest from. Where do you want to put your money at? Where do you want to stand by? But then also acknowledging the first people of these lands as well that are stewarding a lot of this work. And I know we'll go more into that specifically, but that's a little bit on what Mazaska Talks is doing. So.
No, thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you for the incredible leadership you and Mazaska Talks have shown in this movement. It's been really inspiring to see it catch on in the way that it has, and to see so much Indigenous leadership on this front around the world. I've been particularly moved by the connections that you all have made to fossil fuel projects and the human rights abuses that come with them, and elevating the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women in particular. And I'm curious if you would just say a little bit more about the message that you and the movement is continuing to deliver to the banks in particular, that these are the kinds of things that come with these projects, and what you want them to hear, and that our members can help amplify. And just one plug, I do want to remind folks, you can put your own questions into the Q&A box at the bottom, and we will get to those in a minute. Rachel.
Yeah, and so first I also want to acknowledge Mazaska Talks was co-founded after the divestment with Matt Remley, and he is a Lakota and lives here in Seattle, and I've been privileged to do some amazing work with him. And he also is the author for Indigenous Peoples Day that was first approved here in Seattle and then continued on across the nation. So he's also the co-founder for Mazaska Talks. And so when we talk about, you know, wanting to connect to these grassroots people that are doing this work, you know, Matt Remley is on that forefront. I also want to point out Tara Hauschka, who, when we talk about Line 3, Chase Iron Eyes, Joy Braun, Curtis Yaz are all doing Keystone. The Unistoten people. I mean, there's just a number of issues that we have tied to Indigenous communities that these fossil fuel projects are tied to. And so one of the biggest issues that has come from this, that has come from the light of this divestment movement and really bringing Indigenous people to that forefront, is talking about the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, which isn't just our women. It's also, you know, when we think about our prison systems and just the very systematic things that are put into place that have continued the genocide of Native people and the continued violation of sacred lands. And so one of the biggest issues is our missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so these fossil fuel projects actually build man camps on these pipelines. And these man camps are out in the middle of nowhere near our Native communities. And so our women go missing at the highest per capita in the United States. And on top of that, we have over 5,000 women who have not been reported, searched for. It's an ongoing epidemic, women that are missing and murdered as a result of these fossil fuel projects because of these camps, but also because of the trucks that carry these fossil fuels that carry from state line to state line. And because a lot of our reservations intentionally are in places with lack of food, also in the middle of nowhere where women can go missing and no one knows except for their loved ones. So really understanding these fossil fuel projects, it's not only the desecration of our Mother Earth, it's also the desecration of our women and that sacredness and that continuation of being able to bring children into this world because of our women going missing. And we have the highest epidemic in, in First Nations Canada, our women here. So I think really understanding that this is bigger than just having people divest from banks. This is actually a genocide against Indigenous people all over the world. When we look at the work that we've been doing, particularly, I know we've gone to the UN, we've gone all over the world and talked about also even the banks in other countries in Europe, France, and a number of other places, and how they're also invested in these projects. So Indigenous people are being violated all over the world. And so I think it's also important that we talk about these violations of our sacred lands, having our dead, dug up for a pipeline to be put through, having up in Unistoten, having their front lines being taken down so that they can run these pipelines through, our people being brutalized, penalized, the number of legislation that gets passed to stop protests, but then we see what's going on right now. And so I thank you for giving me this platform for, this time to actually talk about this issue. And there's amazing grassroots people. If you look up Roxanne White, and you want to learn anything on the topic of missing and murdered Indigenous women, Abigail Echo Hawk. I mean, there's so many Indigenous women that are doing this work, and truly, these are resources that you can learn and that you can reach out to and really, gather more on these topics. So.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you again for the leadership that you and the others you've mentioned have shown. It is an honor to work with you and to hear from you. And I do think that one of the reasons we're seeing banks and these big institutions start to listen to the movement is because of the horrific human rights that do often go with these big projects, and with fossil fuel projects in particular, and the leadership of yourself and so many you've mentioned in raising that nexus. And I think it's important for campaigners and for our members to see that these two things often go hand in hand, and just all the more reason to be standing together and building a movement together in fighting for a better world. And Ben, I'd love to turn it to you to talk about some of these successes that we have seen in the banks really starting to recognize that these projects are destructive for the communities that they're going through and for the climate. And if you could talk to us a little bit about why the Sierra Club is really investing in this strategy, and why the global financial sector is one of our most important targets in our broader work to combat the climate crisis and build a more just society.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's great to be with you all today. Thank you so much for tuning in and for your support of our work. My name is Ben Cushing. I'm a campaigner with the Sierra Club based in Washington, D.C., and I lead our financial advocacy work. And as Lena said, I just want to talk a little bit about how this work fits into the Sierra Club's broader strategy on climate and fossil fuels, as well as the broader movement taking place that we are very much a part of. So I think one thing to just state off the bat that's really important to understand is that many people understand that the fossil fuel industry is one of the key drivers of climate change, environmental destruction, human rights abuses that Rachel outlined. I think people historically think a little bit less, although that's changing, about the way in which the financial industry that supports the fossil fuel industry is equally culpable and implicated in climate destruction and environmental degradation and human rights abuses. And that's why it is so key that our campaigning and advocacy and grassroots organizing focuses not only on the fossil fuel industry and extractive industries, but also on the financial industry that backs them up. So I think as folks probably understand, in order to develop new fossil fuel projects and development, companies really need three core things. They need permits, they need financing, and they need insurance, broadly speaking. I think for longtime Sierra Club members and folks who have been in the environmental movement, you know that our work has often focused on that first piece, on permits, fighting battles in the courts and regulatory processes to prevent pipelines and coal plants and other destructive projects. And what we've been doing a lot more in recent years is also going after the financing. And increasingly, there is a broad movement to stop the insuring of new fossil fuel development. And if we can stop those three things, we can stop the expansion of fossil fuels that is crushing our climate and causing human rights abuses across the planet. So just to break down a little bit what the problem is that we're facing in the financial industry, there are kind of three key prongs that we can look at and that there has been a real movement building up to take on. One is banking. So this is, big banks that you're probably familiar with: JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Citi, Bank of America. And those four banks that I just named are the four largest banks in the US, and they're also the four largest funders of fossil fuels in the world. They outpace banks from any other country in the amount of fossil fuel development that they fund. This is an issue that the Sierra Club and our partners have been tracking for a long time. Every year we put out an annual scorecard called Banking on Climate Change. And the most recent version showed that in the 4 years since the Paris Agreement was adopted, so that's 2016 through 2019, major banks around the world financed $2.7 trillion worth of fossil fuels just in those years since Paris. And that financing has been on the rise each year. So while these banks, pay lip service to supporting the Paris Agreement, their portfolios show another thing. So that's banks. Another key pillar of the industry is asset management. This is an area that folks may be a little bit less familiar with, but if you have a 401k or you're invested in a public pension fund, very likely that you are connected to one of these companies like Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, Fidelity. These are companies that manage massive portfolios and invest in the stock of basically every public company that you can think of, not only for our purposes here in the energy sector, but also in the financial sector. And so companies like BlackRock not only have an enormous amount of power in terms of how they direct investment, but also the power that gives them to shape corporate behavior through shareholder engagement and voting. So if you just take BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, those big three alone often control 20% of the total stock of major public companies like Exxon, for instance. And if they were to actually use that power to vote in accordance with climate action and human rights, that we could actually push these major companies to take real action. But historically, these major asset managers have sat on their hands and blocked and undermined action through shareholder voting. And the same goes for those major banks. So those largest U.S. banks, JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Citi, Bank of America, they are also controlled in large part by these huge asset managers. And so that's a key pillar here as well. And then lastly, I just want to mention the insurance sector, which is so critical here as well. As it is probably intuitive to most folks, companies need insurance to get projects off the ground, to build new coal plants or pipelines or drilling projects. And there's been an incredible movement that's been growing over the last few years under the Insure Our Future campaign that is calling out major insurance companies like AIG and Liberty Mutual and others that insure these destructive projects, provide the insurance that they need, and that they also take their customers' revenue and invest it back into the fossil fuel economy, which further exacerbates risk. So if we look at these three key pillars of banking, asset management, insurance, it is clear that the financial industry and that Wall Street is one of the key drivers of the climate crisis and the human rights abuses created by the fossil fuel industry. And so we'll talk a little bit more about some of the recent events that's been happening, but just to say, what we've been doing about it, that's the problem. And so what's the solution? The Sierra Club, in partnership with a growing movement of organizations, including Mazaska Talks and many others, has been building a movement to really take on the financial industry and Wall Street companies and to challenge their investments in destructive industries. And it's been incredible to see that work grow over the last few years. Rachel mentioned the inception of Mazaska Talks a few years ago, and going after the banks that had financed the Dakota Access Pipeline. And that work has continued on and just only grown. And so folks may have seen over the last few months the Stop the Money Pipeline Coalition that the Sierra Club and Mazaska Talks and many other organizations are a part of, that has just sprouted up in the last few months to really bring together all of these fights, not only on banks, but also asset managers and insurance companies, and to really put this fight against the financial industry right at the center of the climate movement. And so that's been a big piece. And then the other thing just to highlight is also the work that we've been doing to directly engage with companies. So not only are we building a massive movement of activists all across the country, but we are also taking this fight to the boardrooms and engaging directly with major financial institutions and meeting with them alongside Indigenous leaders and frontline partners. And I think this has been, most critical in our fight to stop drilling in the Arctic refuge, which Dan will talk a little bit more about. But this is an area where we have been fighting for years to prevent drilling from happening in the Arctic refuge. And over the last couple of years, we've engaged directly with major banks in the US and around the world to call on them not to finance Arctic drilling, including going to meet with JP Morgan Chase and Citi and Goldman Sachs and many of the world's largest banks, alongside our partners from the Gwich'in Steering Committee in Alaska, who are the indigenous people that have been fighting to prevent drilling. And so we've been meeting directly with these banks and giving that opportunity for the Gwich'in to explain why these are human rights issues. And the results have been really heartening and inspiring. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But just wanted to say that this fight has been waged not only through our grassroots movement building and the power that comes from all of you, but also working directly with frontline communities to meet directly with these companies.
Thank you so much, Ben. Really exciting momentum that we're seeing on this front. And I think even more important right now, particularly in the financial downturn that we're seeing as one of the devastating impacts of the crisis, that access to capital is going to be even more important to these companies. And so the more we can do to make these investments look as risky as they really are, the more important. So Dan, could you talk a little bit about that, about why this work is particularly important right now, and maybe touch on a little bit more of the work we're doing to protect the Arctic?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just take a few minutes, and thanks so much for that background, Rachel and Ben. In late 2017, the tax reform bill, they shoved in at the last minute a provision to open up the National Wildlife Arctic Refuge to oil and gas development. And Trump, in fact, made it clear that that was a priority and that they were going to move forward and get oil rigs in there and all of these, assumptions that it was just going to happen. So in that space, we have been a partner with the Gwich'in, who are the indigenous people that grew up, and their entire culture is around the porcupine herd of caribou, who use the Arctic refuge as the birthing and calving ground for one of the largest migratory herds in the world. And partnering with them, we went out and eventually got about $2 trillion in assets under management to sign on to a letter that we sent to every single oil and gas company and every single domestic and international bank, laying out that it is enormously risky for them to go into the Arctic refuge. A number of human rights violations would occur. Just as Rachel said, oil and gas development always comes with these human rights violations for indigenous people. Great financial risk, because a lot of that oil will probably never come out of the ground as we become increasingly constrained around carbon. And enormous reputational risk, particularly for consumer-facing companies like banks. So we laid that out, sent that letter, and then followed up with a number of face-to-face meetings with the leadership of many of those banks where the Cushing actually came to New York and sat down across the table and made their case in a passionate and very authentic way. In addition, we showed up at a bunch of annual meetings of these banks last year and then this year as well, once again with the Cushing as partners. And I'm happy to say that the momentum has been building, and 5 of the 6 major domestic banks within the last 2 months have told us that they have changed their policies to no longer allow for those banks to finance Arctic oil development and Arctic oil extraction. So the only bank that is still a holdout, believe it or not, is Bank of America. And in a minute, Ben will tell you about some actions that you can take at Bank of America. Also, Chase continues to be the other bank that a number of the organizations are focused on because they are still one of the largest financiers of fossil fuels around the world. But those are a couple of targets that we're really focused on now. I will say that we've been able to delay what Trump had said was inevitable. They have still not come out with a lease sale for any leases on the Arctic refuge. And it may be that they never get there because, you know, estimates are you got to sell oil at about 100, 120 bucks a barrel for any kind of chance of making a profit in the Arctic refuge. And right now, I don't know, oil's probably less than 10 bucks a barrel. So just to say, even though, you know, environmental concerns are always paramount for us, we really felt that making the case around financial risk and human rights violations was ultimately what made the difference with these banks and the leadership of those banks. So anyways, I'll just turn back to you, Lena.
Thanks so much, Dan. Yeah, it's really inspiring to hear about these banks responding and starting to move in the right direction with those policy changes. Rachel, I'd love to ask you one last question and then we'll go to audience Q&A. You mentioned a couple of the specific pipelines that leaders in the movement are fighting that have banks that are backing them. I'm curious if there are any of those fights that you think need more attention that you want our members to be aware of, or specific things you're working on right now that you want us to know a little bit more about, or any specific banks that you think we should be targeting?
Definitely, Ben, thank you for bringing up the Stop the Money Pipeline campaign. We're all working on that one. So definitely Chase Bank. Chase Bank is definitely one we want to be paying attention to, largest funder in the world of fossil fuels or investor. And so I think they're always someone to consider paying attention to. Jamie Dimon. I know a number of people have asked, like, who do they pay attention to? And I know for us, you know, because I know a lot of times people's depth of work isn't as involved as ours is. So I think when we can give them pieces that they can do, anything like divesting your credit cards, anything, you know, your bank account, any piece of that helps. But also we've, you know, looked up who the regional managers are for these specific banks and things. But as far as the pipelines, Indigenous communities a lot of times are always the ones that are affected by this. So particular projects, obviously Line 3 is an ongoing one. A couple weeks ago, Mazaska Talks hosted a Zoom meeting similar to this, where we had leaders from all of these particular pipelines in First Nations Canada, here in particular fights, Puyallups LNG plant, KXL. So if you can always go to Mazaska Talks, our Facebook link, and there is a live, there is a link on there to watch, and you can find out more. And they also, we had Tara Halshka, Chase Iron Eyes, and a number of other leaders on there, Kaya George from First Nations Canada. And if you listen to it and you also go into the links, there are different websites and tools and different things that people are able to check into. Mazaska Talks, we're lucky to work with amazing partnerships like Sierra Club, also 350 Seattle, who has done amazing work here and really been a great ally to us, and always making sure that Indigenous leadership is at the forefront. I think allyship is really important to talk about when we talk about this work, because I think creating those platforms for these conversations to happen, you have to actually put the people there that are affected by this. So I thank you guys for having me on here today. But also, like I said, 350 Seattle, who is doing amazing work with Stop the Money campaign, with the Chase campaign. There's a number of other campaigns, and so they've done great work with us. So I think it's always important to know. And the toddler has made it almost an hour. But again, continue, divesting. Every bit of it does make a difference. It is all Wall Street banks. Our credit unions are definitely areas that we're looking more to for support. And like I said, private, public banking. That's really kind of the next forefront for us here in Seattle that we're particularly working on, is moving that to Indigenous communities owning their own public banks, in hopes that we can put this power into our communities to, fund education, true green, sustainability, and these different projects. So again, check out Mazaska Talks for us and all the things that you guys are doing. You can always look up Stop the Money campaign and all of the different, we're always doing actions here in Seattle. We love bank takeovers and sending letters and emails and making people mad and shutting the city down. So you can always keep out an eye on those kind of things. They tend to happen. So again, thank you guys for giving me the platform to be on here today, and all of the work that you are all doing, and and how we're all coming together to support one another. So thank you.
You all, I love seeing the headlines from Seattle. You all are always making the headlines out there with your actions. It's really inspiring. And thank you for touching on those individual actions that folks can take. Where I'm looking through the questions that audience members are putting in, and we have almost 120 questions. So lots of interest in this topic. And several of them I saw off the top of my head from Stephen, Richard, Kate, are all interested in those kinds of personal actions that folks can take. So Rachel, you've mentioned a bunch of them, of closing your account with the big US banks and going to your local credit union. Ben or Dan or Rachel, I'm curious, are there other actions that we are encouraging folks to take, either for divesting their own personal finances or kinds of advocacy actions that we're asking folks to take? Ben, I know we have an action towards Bank of America that we are asking folks to take today too. Can you speak to that a little bit, Ben?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, folks, who are interested in moving their money from banks like Chase and Wells Fargo into local credit unions or banks like Amalgamated should definitely check out the Mazaska Talks website. They have great resources and a great how-to guide that'll walk you kind of step by step. And, importantly, give you the step of sending a letter to the banks as well to say why you're moving your money. I think it's important to make that clear that you're not just moving your money for any old reason, but you're moving your money because of their investments in fossil fuels, and that if enough of us send that message loud and clear, we think it can break through. And yeah, as Lena mentioned, and as Dan touched on, we've seen this incredible momentum of major banks around the world and now in the U.S. Changing their policies in response to demands from Sierra Club activists and the Cushing Steering Committee and many others to not finance Arctic drilling. 5 of the 6 largest US banks have decided not to finance new Arctic drilling development. And Bank of America is the only one of those big 6 US banks that has not yet taken this step. So we have an action where folks can send a message directly to the CEO of Bank of America and tell him to change the bank's policy on that. And I think we can share that link in the chat here, and we'll send it around afterwards as well. But that's a really critical step that folks can take right now. And I think another piece, as I touched on before, around asset managers is that many of you, may have connection with institutions like BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street, either through your 401k plans or public pension funds. One of the critical things that we can do right now, and this is like urgency on the timescale of less than a week, is that we can send a message to those big asset managers to hold JP Morgan Chase accountable for being the world's largest funder of fossil fuels. So JP Morgan Chase's shareholder meeting is this coming week on Tuesday. And that is a venue where shareholders in the company will be voting their shares on key issues. There is a resolution on the ballot to ask JP Morgan Chase to align its investments with the goals of the Paris Agreement. There is also a vote that has been getting a lot of attention on the re-election of one of JP Morgan Chase's board members, a man named Lee Raymond, who was the longtime CEO of ExxonMobil and one of the chief architects of the climate denial campaign that Exxon waged. And lo and behold, he's also been on the board of JP Morgan Chase for 3 decades and has been the lead independent director of JP Morgan Chase for about 2 decades, meaning he has the most power on the board of JP Morgan Chase other than their CEO, Jamie Dimon. And so due to an outpouring of pressure from activists and state treasurers, the comptroller of both New York State and New York City came out and said that they would vote their shares against Lee Raymond continuing to be on the board of Chase. Chase recently began to back off and is demoting Lee Raymond from that position. Now, he's still up for election to stay on the board, and so we need to send a powerful message that he does not deserve a place on the board of Chase, and that Chase can remove him and begin to take serious action to stop being the world's largest funder of fossil fuels. And the key, biggest leverage point we have to do that is to call on the largest shareholders of Chase, and those are BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, the 3 largest asset managers who are the 3 largest shareholders of Chase, and demand that they vote their shares. They hold millions, hundreds of millions of shares of JP Morgan Chase. And if they voted those shares against Lee Raymond, we could actually have a chance of removing him. So we just put another link there in the chat, and you can send a message to those 3 big asset managers. So those are a few of the calls to action we have, and they are all really timely and urgent right now.
Thank you so much, Ben, and thanks for all the work you're doing on this. Ben is leading the charge for the Sierra Club with so many of these actions that we are taking to make sure our members' voices, like yourselves, are heard with these big banks and institutions to shift from the bad to the good. One question that I saw that I really liked from Carol Warren, she asks, is the Sierra Club fighting to discontinue the subsidies that oil corporations are receiving from the federal government? Which I think is a really good question, particularly in the context of the big bailout bills that Congress is passing right now. And with the financial downturn, the government is stepping in, and are they going to bail out the oil and gas industry? And so are we working, can you talk a little bit about how we're working to fight public money into fossil fuels as well? And I'll put that question to anyone who'd like to answer it.
Yeah, well, I think Lena, you've been leading the charge on that for the Sierra Club as well. So, of course, chime in with the great work you've been leading on that. But, that is a big piece of it as well. And of course, we have been fighting, to ensure that the bailout and stimulus money that is coming out of Congress is not going to bail out oil companies that were already failing before this crisis, which is a really key point to underscore. Oil companies would like folks to believe that they were doing great and had a long horizon ahead of them up until March, and then everything went down the tubes, and that's just not the case. For a decade now, fossil fuels have been underperforming and in steady decline, and so we've been fighting to make sure that Congress is not directly bailing out fossil fuel companies, and also critically making sure that the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department, which have been appropriated funding, taxpayer funding to help out companies that are suffering are not doing favors for oil executives that have been lobbying them. Unfortunately, we continue to see Republicans lobbying the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department on behalf of those oil companies and seeking special bailouts on their behalf. And the Sierra Club is continuing to fight that every step of the way. And it's notable, that this work that we, have on the private financial sector and the federal government are increasingly becoming intertwined. BlackRock, which I mentioned, is the largest asset manager in the world, and they've actually been hired by the Federal Reserve to manage hundreds of billions worth of dollars in corporate debt buying on behalf of American taxpayers. So Federal Reserve is just outsourcing that work to a private corporation like BlackRock, which is really concerning on a number of levels. And so we're fighting to ensure that that our government is not bailing out these companies, and that Wall Street is not doing that either. And also we can drop in the chat here as well the scorecard that I mentioned earlier. The Banking on Climate Change report is a report that we conduct with the Rainforest Action Network and Indigenous Environmental Network, Oil Change International, a bunch of other groups. And that scores the world's largest banks on their fossil fuel financing. And again, it shows that the 4 largest US banks are also the 4 largest funders of fossil fuels in the world. So that's JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Citi, and Bank of America. And again, all of those banks but Bank of America have taken action recently to rule out funding for new Arctic oil development, including in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Bank of America has not. So go to the action that's in the chat there and send Bank of America a message. And we'll also share the report card link as well.
Thanks, Ben. And emphasizing for folks, there are so many important actions you can take right now towards these big corporate actors to push them to do the right thing. We do want to stress that we are asking folks to reach out to their members of Congress too. Even in this time of everyone at home, members of Congress are increasingly using social media to interact with their constituents, Instagram or Twitter, Facebook even. You can do these things directly from your own home and still safely pressure your members of Congress not to bail out the oil and gas industry and the fossil fuel industry, and support things like the Rewind Act that Mike mentioned right at the top of the call, which would ensure that if any money goes to this industry in this time, it's to support workers and to make sure that they are transitioned in a sustainable and just way into new industries. We actually have a training on how to do that tonight. If you could possibly stand another Zoom call, we will plug the invite for that training into the chat as well, so folks can join that if you're interested in learning how to use social media to pressure your member of Congress, which is really important now. So we are almost at the top of the hour. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so I want to give space for our panelists to offer any closing words and just say thank you again to everybody for joining us. This has been an incredible learning experience for all of us. We now have 160 questions in the Q&A, so overwhelming interest on this topic. Stay with us. We're going to keep doing this work, and we would love to keep talking with you about it. Join us next month for our forum on how the Sierra Club is planning to help win the election later this year. Also critically important for combating the climate crisis and building a more just society. So thank you all, and I will let our panelists close us out with a final word. Dan, you start us?
Sure. Just want to thank everybody for your interest. Great questions. Wish we could get to them all, and hopefully we'll continue to try and answer some of those. But thanks so much for your engagement. It's really really inspiring for us who are in the trenches every day, just to see this great interest, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Dan. Let's go to Rachel.
Hi, again, I just want to thank you guys for having me on here today and providing this platform to have these conversations. I think that's one of the greatest things, is just building awareness and understanding how all of these issues are intersectional. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we've seen, is connecting, divestment, banks, you know, environmental justice, social justice. I mean, like all of the issues intersect in so many ways. So I think by having these conversations, we're allowed to connect those, you know, those dots. And so also, you know, again, checking out, you know, our website, you know, for questions, you know, in terms of, you know, the Indigenous involvement and divestment, and also the work that we've gotten to do with so many others and how that's supported. Continue, I mean, look up the hashtag Stop the Money Pipeline. There's always different things about the actions, and also talking about connections to these insurance companies like Ben has been talking about. Liberty Mutual is a huge one that we've really focused on too with Stop the Money Pipeline. So yeah, so, and again, missing and murdered Indigenous women, look up the issue, look up the connections. We're again, all intersectional. And again, thank you guys for being here today, and thank you guys for the work you do.
Thank you, Rachel. Such a pleasure to have you join us. Ben, you want to close us out?
Yeah, just to say thank you to everyone who's able to join. You know, the only reason we're able to do this work is because of Sierra Club members and supporters across the country. And of course, you know, thank you to Rachel and, you know, the partnerships that we have with Mazaska Talks, and, you know, as Dan mentioned, with the Cushing Steering Committee and so many frontline communities and organizations really enable us to do this work and enable us to win on these issues. And so thank you all for your support, and please stay involved, and we'll keep sending you actions.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you.